Right. Well, hello, everybody. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Traci.
We are.
We're here.
Me that we are together and apart. Laura is in Canada. I'm in Chicago, as if Canada is as specific as the big, wild, generic Canada. I'm here.
Laura's in Toronto.
I have so many stories, embarrassing stories about my inability to connect Canadian geography in a proper way. For penance, I need to actually take some sort of Canadian history and geography class. Anyway, sidebar. Laura, I am so glad that you're here, that we're here together. Laura Alary, who I call in my newsletter, the Laura Alary, because you need no introduction at all to my readers. All of the books behind you, you have written with your own hand and brain.
Well, a couple, not all.
Oh, okay.
I have some of my other favorites in there.
Okay, so there's some show and tell. Well, we can talk about the specific ones that you've written. We're together as a part of a series that I'm doing on my YouTube channel about understanding the work of Christ and what does it mean, what specifically the death of Jesus, what theological significance does it have, and trying to move beyond what is the dominant view, the prevailing view, that Jesus's death is redemptive in as much as his blood is what saves us, right? And we can talk a little bit about the different theories and so forth, but that the prevailing narrative is called Substitutionary Atonement. And all of the guests that I'm going to be having on in the next few weeks have moved beyond that view a little bit. And we're going to talk about how and why and some alternative views. Before we hit record, as usual, there's a little pre-chatter, and Laura and I were talking about how really this is one of those topics that the more you dig, the more there is to discover. So I think neither of us think that we're going to get to the bottom. We won't get to the bottom in all of our discussions either. So I think that's enough rambling preamble. And Laura and I were the first conversation in this series, and I had kind of laid out a basic structure for everybody. And the first question that I wanted to ask, I want to be clear that I'm straight up stealing it from Krista Tippett and changing it a little bit. In her podcast, she always asks for guests about the spiritual background of their childhood. And I thought for this conversation, particularly since most of the people watching are trying to watch with their hat on of how to tell this story to children, either parents or ministry leaders, I thought we could talk a little bit about how each of the guests understood this work of Christ when they were children. So would you mind sharing with us, how did you understand Jesus and his work and his death on the cross when you were a little girl, little Laura?
Little Laura. Well, I have to say, I love this question, because I think that the way we encounter stories when we are children really sticks with us, and it shapes how, it shapes us throughout our lives. Mm-hmm. So in my case, the answer has a couple of different facets to it. So my first recollection of even hearing the story of Jesus was my parents reading to me from my children's Bible at night. Now this was a regular part of my life. They read to me every night, but there was, I got to pick something, and then they would read a story from my children's Bible, which I actually have right here. And I'm sure there were many, many people out there who had this golden Bible that came out sometime in the 60s. So yeah, every night. And apparently, my mom tells me I often used to request the story of the crucifixion, which she found really disturbing.
Interesting.
I actually wish I remember why. I don't.
Yeah.
What I do recall, though, I went back just even yesterday and reread the story, and it's basically straight out of the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. They harmonize the Gospels a little bit, but it's basically the biblical account without a whole lot of extra theological overlay on it. So what I remember as a child is thinking that the story was quite exciting. Like it was dramatic. There was betrayal and suspense and violence. And I think I liked that tension and drama, but I know that at that early stage, I definitely experienced it as an observer. I didn't really have any sense that it involved me personally, or that these things happened because of me or for my benefit, or that just wasn't part of the picture for me when I was very young. The other thing though is my parents would read to me, give me a kiss, say goodnight, and they'd be gone. And then the story would just kind of hang there suspended. And I was free to wonder about it, you know, sort of peer at it from different angles, think about it with no fear of judgment and nobody telling me this is what it means. So I didn't realize at the time how significant that was, but as an adult, I've continually gone back to that mode of being with a story and presenting it to children that way. The other kind of, well, quite positive memory is from when I was a little bit older, probably 10 and up. And it was the way we observed Maundy Thursday and Good Friday at my church. So Maundy Thursday, we would gather in the church hall rather than the sanctuary. And there were all these tables spread out as if for a dinner. And there were candles on the table and wine and unleavened bread. And it was very intimate and very warm. And then the next day, the sanctuary would be very dark. We would, the last words from the cross were read, and every time one of the statements, excuse me, one of the gospel last words was read, a candle would be extinguished, and then the organist would sort of arrange the stop somehow and then play the lowest note on the pipe organ. So it almost didn't have a pitch, it just kind of rumbled. Yes. And I can still, when I think about it, I can still feel it resonating in my body. So it was very, very multi-sensory, and the somberness and the sadness of the day was something that I could actually feel. And I also remember how the sadness, I guess, of that story would kind of open a way for sadness about other things. So I think I learned from that some stories are really meant to be felt and experienced rather than analyzed. And I'm not saying that, you know, with respect to this conversation, sure, that theology, Christology, soteriology, I'm not saying they're unimportant, but there's a time for them, and Good Friday is probably not the time. Right. It's better to kind of sort through these things maybe beforehand, and then on that day, just feel the drama of those events the way the first disciples felt them. Now, my third memory is not so positive, and it comes from when I was probably 7 or 8. And it's what I stepped outside my home denomination and I joined this Pioneer Girl group. And that's when I was confronted by substitutionary atonement in a very direct kind of way. And actually, I remember somebody giving me a book called, I think it was called Tell Me About Becoming a Christian. And it was, so even the title, I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on you. It's like, yes, okay, well, if you're a Christian, then this is exactly what you have to believe. Yeah. And if you don't, then see ya. So, you know, it was the classic explanation, complete with the diagrams, the 2 big cliffs with the unbridgeable gulf in between, and then sort of the cross hanging in between, and all the people walking across on it. It caused a tremendous amount of dissonance for me as a kid. I think there were elements of it that appealed to my desire to have some kind of order, like to understand how things work. Sure. So, you know, I'm 7 or 8, somebody's saying to me, okay, this is what being a Christian is. I'm like, okay, if that's so important, I want to understand how to do it. Yeah. Yeah. At the same time, though, there was so much about it that I just disliked intensely. I didn't like what it said about God. I didn't like what it said about me as a person and the other people I knew. And the whole message about what salvation is, just even at that stage in my life, didn't make a lot of sense to me. you know, the vision of God that I saw in that teaching was either wrathful, vindictive, cruel, and maybe even worse to an 8-year-old, grossly unfair.
Yes.
Know your sense
Yeah.
of justice when it's like, what do you mean punishing somebody who didn't do anything? This is
Anything.
just
Yeah.
completely unfair.
Yeah.
Or kind of weirdly helpless, like bound
Mm-hmm.
by this these requirements of honor and justice, and
Mm-hmm.
that just seemed sort of strangely spiritually deficient to me. I thought,
Hmm.
I can forgive people freely,
Yes.
so why why is this
Surely
necessary?
God is better at this.
Yeah,
Doesn't
surely.
demand blood like an angry, yeah. Yeah.
So it really did not make sense to me, and it also, I think, seemed kind of ineffective. Like I couldn't understand how an event that happened so long ago, and I wouldn't have used this language then, but it was transactional rather than transformative.
Yeah. Oof, that's good.
And that didn't make sense to me.
Right.
And also, I couldn't see myself reflected in that story. That this idea of being so maybe not worthless, but so so cut off from the sacred,
Yeah.
from the divine, and worthy of judgment and death.
Yeah.
I did not recognize myself in that picture, and I'm really thankful that I didn't. I'm thankful that I didn't absorb it, because I think those who do have a very long and painful road to kind of unpick that
Mm-hmm.
and learn to see themselves differently.
Mm.
Um,
If they do, right?
if they
Whatever
do, yeah,
happens.
that's right.
Yeah.
Now,
Wow.
having said that, I mean, I was out for a walk with my daughter yesterday, and we were talking about the whole idea of original sin, which had come into our conversation through an album by a Norwegian singer-songwriter, Aurora. Her latest album plays a lot with Genesis or imagery
Mm.
from like there's the garden and the apple, and she has this song, Cure for Me, I Don't Need a Cure for Me. It's sort of
Mm.
undercutting this whole notion of original sin. And my daughter's a huge fan of Aurora, so we were looking at some of the songs and some of the lyrics and comparing them to the creation stories in Genesis, and then talking about Pandora and other mythologies from other cultures that tell the story about who human beings are. And where was I going with this? Oh, I guess that she had also been reading the book Thief. So she was talking about this duality that's part of human beings, that we have potential for such great goodness, but we also have the opposite. There's this shadow side. And so, how do you, like I say, as a 7 or 8-year-old, I couldn't see myself as utterly reprobate.
Right.
But but I also feel that somehow we need to acknowledge that we have both potential and we have this choice.
That's so
Yeah. So anyway,
sweet.
that's some of my childhood background.
Amazing. How old is your daughter, Laura?
Well, the daughter I'm talking about
The
is,
one you're talking about?
yeah, 15.
15? Yeah. I mean, my children are 10, 9, and 5. So yours are 15 and the others are?
Actually, 18, just turned 18, 15, and 13.
Right. So and the 18-year-old is out at college usually,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes back up. And then the youngest is 13. 13?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's like looking into the future a little bit, but those, I mean, we're talking about our own experience as kids, right? Because we're trying to put it in context with what we want to teach. And just hearing your story, so many things stood out to me. I mean, the first, prior to the tract or the little, how do you become a Christian story, it's not that there was no talk of death. I think sometimes there's this misinterpretation of what authors like you and I and others that are trying to move beyond substitutionary atonement, there's kind of this caricature that like, oh, they want to sanitize the story, sweep it up, not talk about death at all, and just paint a picture, a rosy picture for kids, shield kids from death. And I don't believe that at all. I actually believe we need to talk about death and how serious and final it is. Or is it final, right? You know, and you had those feelings, you had the organ rumble, you had the story, you had heard the story. It wasn't the story itself necessarily that was causing all of these feelings. It was the interpretation of it and the theology of it. And people like to say that the substitutionary atonement view is right there in the scripture. And I think a lot of us would argue that it's actually not. It's been laid over the scripture, and we have an inability to see the story for anything else unless we do some hard work. So I want to move to the kind of this next portion of our discussion, but before I do, I have to drop in the fact, and I said this to you before we started, that you have an actual PhD in New Testament.
An actual one.
An actual literal PhD.
What?
And I say that I have lots of feelings about other terminal degrees that are not PhDs, which is why I said an actual PhD, because I think those who have done them, I do not have one. I've walked alongside many a PhD for candidate friend, advisor. So I'm very familiar by extension with the process, but I think that's like saying that you're familiar with birthing a baby. If you haven't actually done it, you probably don't know the actual experience of it, but it is a lot of work. There's a dissertation. We were talking about your dissertation. Do you want to talk about it on here at all, or no?
I can talk about it more briefly than I said.
I would love for you to, and I have this not secret, but this love of reading my friends' dissertations. So I do want to read it, the whole thing.
You might be the third person outside my committee actually to read it.
I do love reading it. And whenever I ask my friends, they're like, they usually say something like that, and then followed up by like, you're super weird, right? I love it. And the reason is, I will just say this, the reason is, in my experience, people's PhD thesis often directly or indirectly is with them the rest of their careers. There's a reason why they chose it. There's a reason why they dug into that. And I was not surprised at all to learn that yours is very directly related to your topic and your work. So yeah, give us the the kind of medium level tour of it. Like what was it about? How did you find it? Tell us about your thesis.
Okay, well, as I mentioned to you when we were talking earlier, I managed to get through a 4-year Master of Divinity degree without taking a single course in Paul, because I had this kind of prejudice against Paul and this idea of who he was, and I thought he was misogynistic. And anyway, I don't know what happened to me exactly, but I decided to do my PhD dissertation in Paul. So I have this transfigured view of Paul, and he and I are now we understand each other better.
You've had some conversations.
Maybe we've had conversations. We've shed tears together. So my thesis, the jumping off point for my thesis was something that Paul says in the opening verses of 2 Corinthians, where he's talking about his own suffering. And Paul talks about his own affliction a lot for various reasons. But in this case, he says specifically that his suffering is for the consolation and salvation of the Corinthian community. And when I read that, it just hit me like a bolt out of the blue. I thought, what a weird thing for Paul to say. It just seems like for him to ascribe that level of significance to his own suffering for your salvation. That's the word he uses. And at first, I thought, okay, a lot of people would actually hear that as kind of a heretical statement. So I was wondering, okay, what does Paul mean by this? And then the language of consolation is thick throughout those 5 verses. I think it occurs maybe 6 times. Anyway, so I wanted to know, okay, who does Paul think he is exactly?
I think a lot of us want to know that.
Yeah, I think so. So what does he think? What does he think he's doing? What significance is he ascribing to his own work? How does he think that his suffering connects with the work and the suffering of Christ? And so what I ended up doing was looking for places in the literature before Paul where that language of consolation is combined with the idea of somebody who is suffering. So where there's a positive or a transformative value ascribed to suffering. And so basically I traced it back. I looked at Greco-Roman literature and Second Temple Jewish literature, and I found it clustered particularly in what are called the righteous sufferer psalms. And then in the prophetic literature that talks about the return from exile, restoration and new creation. So in a nutshell, I guess what I'd always, or one thing I'd struggled with substitutionary atonement and understanding the death of Jesus is how this single event can have such widespread significance. I always struggled with that. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. And in working through what Paul has to say, he connects his own story not only with the story of Jesus, like he's participating in this pattern, but then he's also connecting it with the story of other people who have suffered in the past. And so it's like a much bigger pattern to which our lives can conform. So the death of Jesus becomes less one little event and more part of this big flow or this big pattern in which we can participate. I don't know whether that's makes sense.
It's amazing. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to totally go off of the rabbit trail of our structure, but I kind of do. I think the thing that's so fascinating to me about this is that it is directly related to the conversation that we're talking about. You know, what is the value of suffering, right? It's what, and as Christians, I think we can really sometimes twist the meaning of suffering. There's a difference between having suffered and seeing God's goodness through the suffering and declaring and believing that the suffering itself is redemptive, right? There's just completely different. And you're talking about it with Paul. And I guess the way I'll kind of tie it to where we were planning to go anyway with this conversation is just to ask you, because I'm curious, was it this dissertation that caused you to open up your mind about the substitutionary atonement piece, or was it, or which came first, I guess? You know, was your curiosity in this because you were already moving beyond substitutionary atonement, or was it through this process that you changed your view or started to open it up, I guess?
It was much earlier. I'd already started to move, well, like I say, because substitutionary atonement didn't completely consume my childhood, there was always alternatives to it. I continually wrestled with it for years, but I think it was when I came to seminary, not to do doctoral work, but to do my basic degree in theology, that's when I really sat down and worked through some of these questions in a more systematic way. And that's really what helped me to break through, I think. I can share a few of the key insights. If that,
I would love it. Yeah.
Okay, so I think the first thing, and this may sound painfully obvious, but you know, sometimes it takes us a lot of time to plow through things, and then we think, well, why didn't I see that before? And that is, the crucifixion didn't come with an explanation, right? Like
in the Bible, you mean?
No, before
when
that.
It happened. When it happened.
The actual event.
Okay. Yeah.
It's shocking, tragic, bitterly disappointing. And I think, I mean, the resurrection too, whatever that was also shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable. So I think we have to imagine the first followers of Jesus experienced those things as events. And then after the shock wore off, struggled to discern meaning in them. And I find that very consoling and very human, because that's what we all do. I mean, we're walloped by things in life that we struggle to comprehend. And what do? Well, we look to the resources that we have. including our own experiences, in their case, their scriptures, sacred texts, ideas, concepts from our culture, and we use all of these things to try to make sense of what's happened. So by the time we come to the New Testament, which we think of as kind of like eyewitness, but already those texts bear the mark of considerable theological reflection. So like the New Testament passion narratives, if you look at them carefully, each one has its own theological flavor and its own kind of distinctive take on the death of Jesus. One of my favorite stories from the New Testament is the disciples meeting the risen Christ on the road to Emmaus, and they get this crash course in biblical interpretation from him. I mean, that almost certainly reflects a much longer process of coming to see and understand the cross in light of earlier texts.
Can you explain what you mean by that when you say they get a crash course in biblical interpretation on the road to Emmaus?
Well, because they're walking along and they're turning over in their minds these events that are still so fresh for them. And then, you know, this mysterious figure comes up and says, "What are you talking about?" And they say to him, like, where have you been? Do you not know?
Have you not heard?
Have you not heard? And it says he began to open the scriptures, and then their hearts burned. Like, that's just such a great phrase. But I like this idea of opening the scriptures, because it's not something that they hadn't read before, but all of a sudden, everything sounds different to them because of the connection that he's made. Like, he sparked this connection between these inexplicable events and then these older texts. They've never put them together in that way, and all of a sudden, poof, something ignites for them.
Do you feel like this is a common interpretation of that text? I don't think I've reflected on that much. I don't when people are preaching, myself included, on this text, it's more about encountering Christ, not about the text itself. So I love that. I'm gonna have to look at that again. Yeah.
One of my favorite stories, though.
Yes.
So I guess just coming back to seminary and what it did for me theologically, I guess it gave me the sense that the starting point for everything was some kind of experience of salvation. Like, whether that was a sense of forgiveness or new life or healing or hope, whatever it was, that's the experience. And then people work backward from that. Mm-hmm. So they make meaning by drawing on the resources that are available to them, including scripture, and also including cultural images and metaphors like sacrifice, which is part of both Jewish and Greco-Roman world. Yeah. So, I mean, it was really illuminating for me to realize that New Testament writers use so many different metaphors to talk about the significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Sacrifice itself is this multifaceted metaphor, because there's more than one kind of sacrifice in the ancient world. It doesn't just mean, oh, I'm going to do this to propitiate an angry God, or to expiate sin or something. Like, there's lots of kinds of sacrifice. Redemption from slavery, victory over evil powers, reconciliation, new creation, participation, revelation. Like, they're all there in the New Testament, and they're overlapping each other. So that tells me, or rather it reminds me, that they are metaphors, and they're not meant to be over literalized. Like, to glom onto one of them and to say, okay, this is the definitive explanation. Yeah, that's a mistake. Yeah. And I think what's true of New Testament writers is also true of all of these later, like, historical theories of atonement. They are also attempts to make sense of something difficult in terms of what's familiar. So whether those are like ideas and social structures and symbols from your own time and place. That was really liberating for me.
Yeah. I love what you say about metaphor and symbols. I mean, as you know, we both of us like to think about what symbols and metaphors we can use with children, and how
Mhm.
we can open up the story in ways that is, different. So.
Which kind of, I guess, carries me into the next
Yeah.
stage of moving beyond,
Sure.
because like a lot of this work that I was doing was still, it was still up here, it was still pretty
Yeah.
intellectual. And then I became a parent. And then all of a sudden, wow, like the challenge is very different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm looking at my son, who was born a month after I convocated with my PhD. So I still had all of this academic stuff very fresh in my head. And then I'm holding this baby, looking at him going, okay, what am I going to tell him?
Yeah.
What story, what narrative am I going to give him? And how am I going to share it?
Yeah.
So there's no way I could look at this precious baby and say, okay, I'm going to tell you that you're fundamentally sinful and you need to be saved from the punishment of death by the shedding of the blood of an innocent victim 2,000 years ago. Like that was a hard no.
Mm-hmm.
No. I knew that there was so much in the story of Jesus that I valued and found spiritually transformative. I wanted to pass it on. So I had to go through this process of kind of taking some of those ideas and insights and turning them into principles that I could actually use as a parent.
Yes. Yeah.
And like you do this so well in your book. When I think back now and my search for resources, man, I wish I'd had it.
Oh.
Truly. I think if I had to boil it down, I would say, looking back to my own childhood, letting the story stand, keeping it really simple, making room for questions and genuine response. Like I wanted my children to be able to ask anything they wanted, and also to react to stories in a way that was authentic without worrying about getting it wrong or feeling judged.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I wanted to create a multi-sensory environment because I think that is important for how children learn. And I had those memories from childhood. So, you know, from the time my son was really little, we had a seasonal table, and I made all kinds of cloths. Like I think I have, this is one of them, it's purple. But I have this whole wardrobe of cloths in different colors, liturgical colors, but also the seasons of nature as well. And we were constantly bringing in symbols from outside and changing what was on the table. You know, textures, smells, colors, all of those things. But especially I wanted to provide a lot of good books that would encourage engagement with the story. And that was a real struggle when it came to Lent and Easter.
Yeah.
Because so many of the books contained the language and the logic of substitutionary atonement. Yeah. And I just didn't want it. Or they were gratuitously violent or gory. Yes. Or they talked about the death of Jesus as if it was this standalone event that wasn't connected to anything else, let alone the rest of Jesus' life. Right. So I knew what I wanted, but I just had a really hard time finding it. So I wrote my own.
Ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding.
That turned out to be this, Make Room. Actually,
wait, don't put it away. Don't put it away.
I won't put it away.
Are you going to talk about it? Because let's still this is Make Room, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe this is how we met each other.
Yes, it is.
So I think either Paraclete had sent me a copy, or somebody said, you have to read this book. This is like your spirit sister wrote this book, and I read it, and I knew by reading it that we were like, in sign language we say that, you know, the same theologically. So you succeeded. So let's talk about this book. Yeah, tell people that don't know about it, and how does it work, and what does it do, who's it for?
Who's it for? It's for children and for their caregivers, their parents, grandparents, teachers. What it tries to do is to set the story. It's an introduction. The subtitle is A Child's Guide to Lent and Easter. Mm-hmm. So what I was trying to do in this book is to present a more positive view of Lent as an opportunity to create space for growth and transformation. And I wanted to tell the story of Jesus in a more comprehensive way. So it wasn't just, I wanted to include the passion narrative, but to set it in the context of Jesus' whole ministry and life. That was really, really key for me. I think when we had our first conversation about this book, you asked me to pick out one of my favorite passages in the book. Mm-hmm. And that is, I have to find it, the foot washing scene, Maundy Thursday. And I have here, I'm just going to read a tiny bit. Before the meal, Jesus took a cloth, a bowl, and a pitcher of water. He got down on his knees and washed his friends' feet, which were dirty and sore from walking. That is who Jesus is. He pours himself out like water from a pitcher. He touches what is dirty and hurting and makes it clean and whole. And the reason that's an important passage for me anyway is that it does present, that's a sacrificial image.
Yes.
But it's not substitution.
Right.
It's not propitiation. It's sacrifice as a gift of love that's willingly given. It's the transformative power of love in action. And it's an outpouring that represents Jesus' whole life, like a whole way of being human, yes. Not just the moment of his death.
Right.
So that's kind of in a nutshell where I was trying to go with this book.
Oh, and succeeded so well. The whole book is beautiful, and there's so many ways we could talk the whole time about make room. I don't want to push us to do that, but I do think it's one of the best books out there. And I also wanted to say, just because I can't resist throwing it in there into the conversation because of who I suspect might be listening to this conversation, there are so many Christian educators out there that have an idea or an instinct about a resource that they want that doesn't exist. And sometimes people think, well, who am I to write it? And I believe strongly that we follow our own passions. And when we do that, if we write for ourselves, if we write the thing that we want to have for even for our own family, it's not a guarantee that it will be published. I mean, you and I pitch things all the time that get rejected, but it's a way to start instead of thinking, what does the world want from me? When you try to sort of scratch your own itch or write your own thing for your own people, it's a spiritual discipline in a way. And I resonate with that so much. So many of the author friends that I know, the suffering that we can experience around trying to create a resource that somebody else wants us to do for whatever reason just never works. So there's this Holy Spirit aspect to that book that it comes through in the reading of it, was the resource that you always wanted to have for your own family and informed by an entire actual PhD underneath it.
And in fact, I wrote this and I used it with my own kids for years before it was actually published. Like I shopped it around and it was continually rejected. And kind of, there's a little pang every time that happens, but that's the reality of being a writer. And then eventually it found a home with parents.
Oh man, later I'll tell you about why that's a super meaningful thing for me right now, but that's an amazing story, and that you used it with your own children, and I think following your own parental instincts, right? What your own kids, how you might tell the story. I loved you kind of, I don't think you did it on purpose, maybe you did, I don't know, but you gave sort of these little guidelines for how to tell the story, you know, making room, letting the story stand on its own, making it multisensory. I think also I wrote down alternatives. I don't know if you remember saying exactly this, but you said a little while back that as you were considering a way of moving beyond substitutionary atonement, you had always had alternatives. And that I don't know if that's a super common story that I hear. Can you give examples? Or are you referring to the examples you gave about the organ and the Bible story and the way that your parents gave it to you? Do you have other examples that you can think of?
No, actually, I was referring more to the spaciousness of the way I encountered Bible stories as a very young child.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of just and honestly, like, this has its flaws. Jesus is blonde. I mean, you know, it's not ideal, but there's not a huge amount of theological overlay other than what's in the scripture text itself. So, you know, when I think about I guess the sense of freedom and confidence that I had as a young child, that, yeah, I was free to do this. I was free to ask questions and respond honestly. Like, I could say, no, I don't like that story. Or there's parts of, you know, in Godly Play, some of the questions are, what do you like about this story? What do you not like about this story? Where am I in this story? Those kinds of questions, I think I had the freedom to ask instinctively when I was a kid, and not everybody did.
Yeah. Well, if it's threatening, if there's a lot of pressure around your eternal salvation in terms of getting the story exactly precisely right, then it's going to be anxiety from parents to make sure that children accept a specific interpretation of a story and don't question it. I think the questioning is huge. You know, a whole conversation about that too, but where does doubt and questioning fit in with this story? And I think, you know, one of the things that comes up time and time again around this conversation, I'm sure it will come up in the other conversations that I'm planning to have, is this idea of how I believe the Holy Spirit works through our own intuition. And there's a lot of having to override that intuition if you want to accept substitutionary atonement. We kind of talked about this, right? Like, substitutionary atonement is basically saying you're bad, terrible, so bad that there is a consequence that requires blood, and it's the blood of innocence. So God solved this problem by sending a perfectly sinless person who took all of the sin away in your place, right? Because you are so bad and dirty. And you said, like, at 8 years old, you're like, number one, that's not fair. Number one, can't God come up with a better like, this is really, like, it seems kind of convoluted, like, right? You know, at 8 years old, you have enough intuition to figure that out. So you have to kind of continually bat back what your intuition and kind of common sense is telling you in order to accept that story. And I think people do it because they feel like, well, stakes are high. If I don't accept it in this way, I will burn in hell forever. So I better just, but the questioning part, that's where I'm going with this long thing. The questioning part is, it's such a fragile tower that if you pick at one part of it with a question, the whole thing starts to collapse, right? You have a system, a theological system, wherein questioning, and you used other words that I wrote down when you were talking about how the actual event was, you know, shocking, tragic, bitterly disappointed. And then you talked about how it is for the resurrection, mysterious, also shocking, all these things. If your theology allows you to take all of this and say, well, what about it? Right? Like, what about it? Here's a story. What about it? What have other people said? What do you think about it, 8-year-old child? I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to, and if you're listening to this and not watching, that was a picture of me, like, you know, with my hand kind of down on your head. Like, I'm not going to top down tell you what it means. I'm going to invite you and me together to look at it. it's a completely different way. It's a freeing way. I think the people on this conversation a lot have asked me like, well, what specifically do I need to do to tear down this? And I don't know if it has to be a ton more complicated than trying to ask questions about what other people have said and ask, what do you think? What do you say? That the scriptures, I think, invite us into that. Do you have any more, this is like a veiled, not so veiled attempt to get you to talk about your children's Bible that you wrote and how the atonement is treated in those stories. Do you mind giving us some commercials and examples from that? And
no, I am more than happy. I'm more than happy to talk about Read, Wonder, Listen, but I do have a couple of things to insert before I get there.
Sure.
Because when I hear you talking about, comparing faith to this fragile edifice, I think that's so true, but it makes me so sad.
Yeah.
Because what a way to go through life, constantly terrified, needing to protect what you've built by any kind of question or any new knowledge from outside. I mean, the church has a horrible history of trying to protect its beliefs from like scientific knowledge, like, God forbid we go around the sun, and where does that get us? We're trying to protect ourselves from truth. Right. Why would we want to live that way? It just seems foolish to me.
It still happens. I mean, how many, I'm sure I've had that critique so much, that the reason that I have this view on atonement now is because I went to Princeton Seminary and was corrupted by worldly knowledge in the Ivy Tower, right? And it's when you talk about the comparison to, which one is the sun? Isn't the universe, the earth isn't
talking about Copernicus,
right? Yeah. When you compare it to that, it's like, oh yeah, wow, hello. And then
Giordano,
we can talk about of yours. Anyway, okay, so I agree. And I also love how I said you're building a tower and then you spiced it up with the PhD edifice. So you sound smarter than I am. So yes, right? Like, it's true though. I think of it like a house of cards, right? Because that's why, in my opinion, that's why you can't question something like women in ministry, because if women in ministry can happen, then Jesus didn't do anything. It's like it seems like a logical leap, but I think it's because everything's so tightly.
Yeah, and I'm at a point in my life, and I guess I've been here for a long time, where I think, if it's so precarious that you pull out one piece and the whole thing falls down, then the whole thing should fall down.
Should fall down, right?
Really. So that's where I'm coming from. But getting back to this whole idea of questioning, for me, a lot of that is connected to the respect that I have for children as thinking, honest human beings. So I am a great believer in giving children the evidence at an age appropriate level and letting them work with it. So with really young children, like I say, you kind of give them the bare bones of the story, but then make space for them to wonder about it. And then when they get a bit older, like I've done kind of a version of redaction criticism with kids where, you show them the different passion narratives and say, read these and what do you notice? How do they tell the story differently? What stands out for you about one version as opposed to another? And that can lead to a conversation about how the people who wrote the Bible told the story in different ways, because they also noticed different things and thought different things were important to them and to their communities. Another thing that's kind of...
Can I ask a question? Sorry to interrupt. Can I ask a question about that before you get to the next one? When you do that, first, what age of kids do you do it with? And second, which texts do you use? Do you use the NRSV or do you use a children's Bible?
No, I normally use the NRSV, and I'm talking like 10, 11, 12.
Okay, so which texts would you give them if you were going to do this exercise?
I'll probably give them the synoptics. In fact, I have been known to photocopy pages from synoptic parallels.
Okay.
So it's
And
actually laid out
which version do you prefer of the Bible?
NRSV.
Oh, you do? Okay. I thought you said
Yeah.
I don't give them the NRSV. Okay.
No, I do give them the NRSV.
Okay. Yes.
So another idea is to look at some familiar hymns or worship songs, because we sing our theology all the time. And sometimes what we sing is in contradiction to what we actually maybe believe.
Yes.
So it can be really interesting, I think, for kids to look at how the songs we sing tell the story. Are there parts of the story that are left out? Are there things that are explained in ways that make sense or don't make sense? Do the writers say this is what the story means, or do they kind of let us figure it out for ourselves? So that's kind of, and it just makes kids a bit more aware in worship too. Like,
yes,
sometimes you sing things and don't really think about what it is that you're singing.
Was there any hymns that stick out, just top of mind, that you've done this with?
Oh,
do you try to choose ones do you try to choose ones where you're feeling like there's maybe something in here that doesn't quite sit well with me and I want to point it out? Are you trying to choose the opposite, choose ones that you think are good complements to the scriptures?
I choose both.
Yeah.
So that kids can see that there is a variety.
Yeah.
And sometimes I have to say, these conversations don't have to be imposed on kids. Like, I find that, especially with that sort of 10, 11, 12 age group, I can't remember a year when we were approaching Holy Week when somebody didn't say, so why do we call it Good Friday? Like, why don't we call it Bad Friday?
Right, yes, what's good about this day? Yeah.
And so that was kind of an entryway actually to introducing, in a very pared back kind of way, some of these historical doctrines of atonement. Like, these are some of the ways people have understood the death of Jesus, some of the ways they've tried to make sense of it. But I think for me, the key is trying to connect that process of wondering and meaning making that the children are doing with the work that theologians have been doing for thousands of years. So, in other words, their own questions and thoughts and responses are part of this bigger stream of theological inquiry. So it honors the work that they're doing now, but it also gives them something to grow into.
Right. And so true, right? And it reminds me of the title of Dave Sinus's book, Tiny Theologians, right? And we are all, everybody, I think that's, well, not everybody, but probably everybody that's listening to this is in some way working with some tiny theologian, right? It's not, we could go off on a tangent there, but okay.
Okay, so I am going to come back to Read, Wonder, Listen, if I may.
I'm waiting, yes.
Okay. I am
no rush. I don't mean that in like a tap way. I'm just saying, I won't let you forget is what I mean.
So Read, Wonder, Listen, which, bear with me here, is the children's Bible that I published a few years ago with Woodlake Books. This was such an amazing opportunity for me. Like, I look back now and I think it came along at just the right time in my life. And I'm so thankful that I had it, because talk about freedom. I had phenomenal freedom in writing this. I remember when I first signed the contract, my editor said, so we need to have a phone call and discuss some of these things. And so we got on the phone and he said, so, have you got a plan for what you want to include? And I said, well, I kind of thought that there might be a committee or something.
Yeah, what thought you were going to tell me?
He said, no, it's just you and me. And I said, really? Yeah, so basically I had free reign to take this project in whatever direction I chose to take it. So it was a chance for me to take a lot of these ideas, which were in a bit of a mess. My head was kind of a jumble, and to organize it and distill it and figure out how I wanted to present it to young readers. So it gave me a chance specifically related to this conversation, to tell the story of Jesus in the way I wanted to tell it, but also to set it in the context of a much bigger story. So I got to set it up from the very beginning.
Nice.
And I'll say a little bit about that, because it all does end up sort of feeding into this conversation. So, it's, of course, I'm working in biblical order, starting with the creation stories from Genesis. And I present our original state of being as one of unity. So the phrases are one with each other, one with creation, one with God. And the creatures in the garden have an awareness of this oneness, and they're content in it. But then there's a falling away, because these creatures they forget to look for their sameness, and they start noticing differences, and that kind of overwhelms them. They start to become maybe a bit suspicious of one another, jealous, eventually full of hatred toward the other. So in the stories that follow, there's this constant tension between the truest and the best part of our nature, which is good and intended to be unified. And then this other tendency to forget who we are in relation to one another and to the rest of creation. And so as a result, you've got all this pain and suffering. Stories that follow, a lot of them have to do with choosing one way over another. So we hear about people making choices that lead to reconciliation and peace. So like a story like Abigail and the Better Way. And sometimes they lead to a lot of pain and destruction. So that this kind of human dualism is in there in the stories. Every now and then I got to drop in a story that points to that deeper mystery that sometimes suffering can be transformative. Not always, but sometimes. And I think that the first time it shows up in here was the story of Joseph and his brothers. And this whole idea that, you intended this for evil, and you treated me really, really badly. This is not good. Yes. But somehow out of this, something good has come. I don't understand it, but it's a mystery. Then the next thing I wanted to point out is the stories of exile. So the people are in exile. This is a story of collective suffering and a huge theological challenge that the people as a whole are working through. Like, why has this happened to us? Why has God let this happen to us? Do we misunderstand God completely? Why? And then so they're in a state of confusion and deconstruction, basically. And then they, in the midst of it, catch this glimmer of another possibility. And I'm reading here. Slowly their minds began to open to a mystery, that all their hurt and sadness was not just punishment or bad luck, but something God could use to help and heal. They would need time to wonder about this. And
which story is that one in?
That one is By the Waters of Babylon. And then there's another story from the exile is Ezekiel's vision. And this was an important one for me, I think, because it introduces resurrection as a metaphor. So Ezekiel's vision obviously isn't about an individual person coming back from the dead. It's about a whole community being restored after a time of chaos and disintegration. Yes. So I thought that was important too, to just introduce a different understanding of resurrection. So by the time Jesus walks on scene, basically, the readers, if you've started from the beginning anyway, readers have already been introduced to questions like, what are human beings? What are we meant to be? Why is there suffering? What does it mean? Can any good come of it? And they've also been introduced to the idea of resurrection as a metaphor for all kinds of transformation and new life. So there's this long setup. And then Jesus shows up. And I think that I think it's fair to say that I've kind of laid out the ministry of Jesus or the work of Jesus as being about revelation and teaching, showing us how to live and another way to be human, but also about, and this is getting technical, but interchange or representation, like he becomes what we are so that we can become what he is. Like there's, you know, there's different ways of being human.
Yeah.
And Jesus shows us here's a way that's based on compassion, generosity, forgiveness, acceptance, and love. So there's an emphasis on choosing the way,
Yes.
and that sometimes that choice is really costly.
Yeah. I feel that so much, Laura. I feel like one of the questions that we need to be asking now is, you know, is not Jesus's life, doesn't Jesus's life save us? Right? You know, I don't know if I should admit that, well, it's fine. It's live streamed anyway, but I always say at the celebration of the Last Supper that it was Jesus came to show us, you know, the let's see, how does it go? It's those words of institution. So for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are together proclaiming, and what it says in the liturgy is you together proclaiming the saving death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And I always add the saving life, death, and resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I used to feel like, well, who am I to change this liturgy? But I think, no, it's not accurate, right? It's not accurate to say that it's only Jesus's death. And it's just another sneaky substitutionary atonement thing. And if it's going to be said month after month, year after year. So I love that you make that a focus for read. I always get it wrong. Read, wonder, listen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I want to reference it, I always am Googling it because I'm always like, wonder, read. So is there a way, is there a way you can help me remember it? Because I'm sure it was with intention. First, well, how did you decide to call it Read, Wonder, Listen?
Well, obviously the reading is going to come first.
It has to come first, right? Well, not necessarily, right?
Well, now that you asked me this question, I'm thinking, okay, why didn't I call it Read, Listen, Wonder? Yeah.
It could be any of the ways, actually.
So
if you think about it, I'm not trying to be annoying.
I think partly it was just euphonic, like read, wonder, listen sounded better to me.
It sounds good. Yeah, that's a completely legit way to title something.
You could say the listening is listening to one another. Like maybe the wondering is internal and the listening is more communal.
Well, I usually now get the words right. Read, wonder, listen in some order. I used to be like, it's, you know, and I would throw in other words, but I can't remember what they're now. And I don't want to mess it up or I'll start doing it again. I want to drop in an annoying, unrelated thing, but it is related to our listeners. This Bible is hands down my top choice for children 10 and up. It's not, I think you could you could definitely read it with younger children. I think the only reason it's not my top choice for that age is that the stories are a good length. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, I think there's nothing developmentally inappropriate or anything for younger kids. It's one of my favorite storybooks. And I am constantly harassing you because the distribution in the US can be a challenge.
Yeah, I know.
Westminster John Knox. And the only reason I'm saying this is not to harass you yet again. It's to try and get people to push through that barrier to get the book. It is well worth it. Whether you have to, you click on Amazon and it says arriving 4 months from now or whatever.
Or it says it costs $300 or something.
Well,
ridiculous.
We got to figure that out. We got to keep figuring it out. And if enough people harass, it's Westminster John Knox. It's the US distributor, correct? Yeah, I think it is. I've harassed them. And we'll keep working on it, but I should have checked before we got online right now if it's available in the US. But it's well worth it, and it's a book that will have a very long tail, long impact. God is doing a lot with that one. So when it comes to this conversation, the atonement, I think what I'm hearing you say is that you were able to do what you wanted to do. What you think the scriptures do, which is set the context, set this event, this death of Jesus event as part of a larger story. So it's not just about this one story, it's about these concepts, the concepts of sacrifice and redemption. From the very beginning, you're setting it up so that by the time you get to this story, it's already, some of these things have already been addressed way early on in the conversation. I didn't stop you because you're in the middle of talking about great things, but you said, I thought it was like a throwaway line from you. It was so profound. You said, we should talk about what the death of Jesus means, and maybe, Good Friday is not the time for that. And I thought, oh, interesting, right? Because most people, I think they're feeling all this pressure that now is the time to talk about it. I mean, this is why I'm recording these conversations right about now. This is why it comes up all the time. People are like, we got to deal with this now at Easter. And for you to say, this is maybe not the time, I thought, oh, wow, that's a message, right? By the time you get to Good Friday, terrible Friday in some ways, by the time you get to that day, if we haven't talked about it, it puts too much pressure on that. I mean, is that what you're saying, right? That the reason that's not the time is that we should have been talking about it all along. We should already have some, tools in our bag to be able to pull out to interpret this story.
Yeah, I don't think that one day can bear that kind of burden. Yeah. And the other thing is trying to pick it apart intellectually on the day prevents us from experiencing it emotionally. So like in the last many years, actually, the Good Friday service at the church I've been a part of for some time has been a modified Stations of the Cross. Now the congregation doesn't actually move, but a different artist is chosen every year. And the whole service is just kind of a visual meditation on these works of art, interspersed with some music and the story, like passages from the Bible. Yeah. It's very, very simple, but profound.
Yeah. And moving, right? I think, again, not to sound like a broken record, I think revisiting substitutionary atonement doesn't mean that we don't tell this story, right? It doesn't mean that we don't share it. I think it's about balance. I think substitutionary atonement gives us permission in some way because the suffering and blood is redemptive. It causes us to linger on the violent details too much, right? And I think it's unbalanced. It is in but the details are there, right? The details are there. One of the things that I put in my book, which, since we're doing I just showed the cover of my book, Faithful Families for Lent, Easter, and the Season of Resurrection, which is the shortened resurrection. Whoops. There's a chapter in there, chapter 6, on symbols. And my goal there was, I was inspired by those terrible resurrection eggs. I don't know if you know those, but they're little.
Oh, I know the resurrection eggs.
Okay. Little eggs where you're supposed to open it up and tell the story. And they resonate with children's ministers and with me because it's such a clever way to tell a story. And it's blending the eggs, right? You open up the egg and there's like a lot of wonder, but it's almost comically terrifying because you open eggs and it's like, hello, children, let's open up the egg. What's in there? Oh, look, it's a tiny whip.
Yeah, it's a scourge.
It's like a tiny spear. And like these little children's eyes are like, whoa, and it's like, who thought this up? Like, who thought this is a great idea? And I think it's because if those are the important part of the story is that Jesus' blood saves you, then why not? So I thought, well, I'm going to, for this chapter, try and come up with 12 symbols, try to have them be 4 for Jesus's life, 4 for his death, and 4 for the resurrection, and have them all be in the Bible. Because sometimes people are like, oh, this thing is fine, what you're saying, but it's not biblical, right? It's not biblical. So all of these symbols, of course, they should, even though I think there are plenty of symbols that are not from the Bible that we could use, I wanted these to be specifically in the Bible. And so the reason I did 12 was so that you could make your own resurrection eggs and go through and tell the story, right? Without having to be like, hello, here's a tiny crown of thorns, whatever. That's a little side note from where we're going. But
that's an important segue, because I have to say, loved that chapter. I mean,
Oh,
there's
thank
so much
you.
that's good about the whole book, but that one really spoke to me. I guess because I am such a believer in the power of symbols.
Yeah.
And I remember encountering resurrection eggs when my kids were really young and being uh, both appalled, but as you say, it's comically bad in some cases.
Yes.
And around the same time, like I was reading a book that went along with them, and I thought, are you kidding me? Like, I can't do this. And then a really well-intentioned person gave me a recipe for these cookies, and there was a script that went along with it. And so I was reading it in advance, thinking, okay,
I
maybe this
know
is something
this
I can
one.
do with the kid. You know this one where you have to
Yes.
put the nuts in a bag and you give the
And
kids
you beat them?
and you beat the nuts. And
It might have been you that told me about this, but it's like,
yeah,
well
I
thought
I was
out.
both I was laughing and appalled at the same time. Like, here children, put yourselves in the role of the tormentors of Jesus and beat this bag of nuts. I yeah, I was shocked.
It's really bizarre. I've seen it in lots of places, including progressive places that shall remain nameless, where you're like, I think this is not well thought out. I also, since I'm commercialing anyway, it's not a commercial, but the other one I wanted to do a different version of, and I think I'll probably get dinged on this one because it's not really scriptural, is
Jelly beans?
the green prayer. Do you know that one?
Actually, that's so funny, because that was another thing that really stood out for me. And I actually wrote a review on Amazon.
Oh,
And I mentioned that was a real highlight for me. And part of that, and I'm hoping we'll get to this shortly, is that you connected these colors with symbols from the natural world. And I love that, because I think that helping children connect to the rhythms of life and death that are part not only of the material world that they see immediately around them, but the whole cosmic story. Like,
yes.
I read the jelly bean prayer and I thought, yes, like.
Oh, thank you, Laura. So just for those that I think people listening probably do know that there's a lot of jelly bean prayers floating around, and most of them have the black jelly bean represents your own sinful humanity. The red one represents the blood of Jesus. And then there's kind of variations from there. And the black representing sin and darkness is problematic in so many ways, not just the original sin angle, but also from a racial angle, the black equals bad. And so for that prayer, I knew I wanted to redo it. And I started with black as earth, from which things grow. And that's where all of it ended up being around the natural one. I thought, well, this is springtime. This is the way I want to go with it. And so I think I'm going to ask Chalice if they'll let me release it with like pictures of jelly beans and just send it out so that people can use that, whether or not they buy the book. Cause I think it's
beautiful.
That could do a lot of good, right, in the world. And sometimes we choose these things, and I don't blame us as children's ministers for, number one, grabbing what's freely available. Number two, if it's almost like if everybody's doing it, it must be okay, I guess, right? Like we don't question it because like, well, 500,000 children's ministry leaders can't be wrong. The red one must be about the blood of Jesus, like yum, yum, right? So I think, well, thank you for that. It's high praise and high endorsement coming from you. And I think I'm so glad to have the chance to talk to you. Did we cover everything we planned to? We took some detours, so it's okay not to go.
Well, the one thing that we didn't get to, and I'm not even sure, because this is still very much in process for me, is this whole idea of the cosmic story. Like, talk about certain questions arising for us at certain times of our lives. I think for me, the past, 5, 6 more years, I've continually been asking myself, how does the Christian story, including the story of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, how does it relate to knowledge that comes to us from other sources about ourselves, about the world around us? I mean, over the past few weeks, I've been following the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope.
Ah, yes.
I find it hugely exciting. I mean,
Yes.
Hubble has given us insight into, well, into our universe that just has expanded our understanding of reality. And this is going to enlarge that even further. And I think that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
But it does push me, and I think should push everybody to ask, you know, here we are, we're part of this almost 14 billion year old story of a dynamic and evolving universe. So what does it mean to talk about salvation or redemption in that context, especially if you're trying to tie it to one event at a particular time and place? It just feels too small, too parochial. Like, what does it mean? And it's I think pursuing some of these interests and learning more has really pushed me to redefine or to re-examine anyway my own understanding of well, what salvation is and how what the symbol of the cross actually represents for me. It's been yeah, it's a process.
It is a process, and I think, I mean, there's so many ways to go with what you just said. I think we've been kind of leaving breadcrumbs throughout the conversation. You know, if you're not afraid of that, if you're not afraid of what you'll find, if you keep asking questions and looking deeper and deeper and looking farther out in your telescope, I think there is great, as you said, the freedom that you had as a child, the stories there, and then you're left to wonder about it and think about it. Do you have another one?
Well, I was reading this book, Field of Compassion by Judy Canato, and she asks, oh, I'm going to have a collapse here. She asks some of these questions, and talking about symbolism. I mean, she very explicitly says, how does the Christian story relate to the universe story or the cosmic story?
Yeah.
And so she takes the cross and she compares it to the symbol of a supernova, which of course is this catastrophic death of a star. But what does it do? It forges heavier elements and it's like scatters these seeds of new life into the universe. And I think that that's a very provocative kind of comparison, that death and life are intricately related, like they cannot be pulled apart. And we see it on a cosmic level as our universe evolves, but we also see it right around us when we go for a walk in the woods and look at a decaying log, and something's sort of coming out of being, and yet other things are coming into being because of it, and can't take them apart. And I think the death and resurrection of Jesus and the idea of death containing the seeds of new life, that's powerful. As we look at our material world, it's powerful psychologically, spiritually. And I think that at some level, even in your jelly bean prayer, how you're connecting the story to the natural world, I think that's doing some of that work there.
That's really profound. I didn't think about that when I wrote it. I mean, the thing that occurs to me as you're talking, I'm like, wow, I wasn't really planning on talking about this, but I may as well. Have you and I ever talked about what happened to me 3 years ago when I was in the hospital? Do you know about that story?
I know the basics of it.
The basics of it. So the basic gist being, I had some really big traumas that I won't go into, and I had made my personal choice to stop drinking wine, which had helped me sleep every night. I think it was kind of helping me, and I had given that up, and I started having trouble sleeping, which really got incredibly serious. It turned into the type of insomnia where I was wide awake for nearly 4 days, which will make your brain I don't even know how physically I survived that, but my brain started, it went into full psychosis, not just a little like, oh, you're a little disoriented. It was like full psychosis experience, such that I had to not only be removed from my house in an ambulance, I had to be in psychiatric lockdown for more than a week, like not even knowing where I was. I mean, the whole experience took, and I'm still uncovering things that I saw there. But miraculously, and I really believe it's the Holy Spirit, the therapist that helped me through this whole experience was willing to work with me through it in the way that I saw it, which was that there was a mystical experience involved, that like the fact that my brain had gone offline, I actually saw some reality there. Like, I mean, I'm not kidding. I was like, I saw the beginnings of the universe and time wasn't linear. Like, you know, somebody could be like, well, you were really bananas, right? And the process of sorting through that and kind of uncovering deeper spiritual truth, that's what I'm writing about right now. It's just like kind of a crazy thing. But it's interesting because I think through that experience and some of the things that I saw and experienced, I feel like with my own brain experienced an expansiveness of this story. And you would maybe think, oh, because of that, you would let go of your Christian faith and move to this like sort of universalist understanding. And it's yes and no. Like on the one hand, I feel like there's this much bigger thing going on. On the other hand, I feel like my Christian faith has deepened on so many levels. This week I'm preaching on 1 John chapter 1, where it says God is light. God is light. And it's like that image is very intense for me now based on everything that I saw. So, I mean, that's getting to the woo-woo, but I think it's a question that I asked you, you know, how does this fit into what the Spirit is doing in our time, you know, 2022? How does this story, we haven't as a people said that it doesn't matter anymore. We haven't said, oh, that was an old story. We still claim that it says something powerful and true. So what is it? And I think the freedom to imagine it and talk about it is like, it's amazing. I love doing it with you, and I could talk all week about all of it. Since we're closing, and since I ended up going way off track, can you tell us about your book? And I forgot her last name. Maria is the first name, the astronomer.
Mariah Mitchell.
Yes. Can you tell us just a little preview? Because it's about, it's kind of full circle, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it is. I hadn't really thought about bringing her into this conversation, but
Me either.
She fits, I think, because she also went on her own spiritual journey. Yes, the book is called The Astronomer Who Questioned Everything, The Story of Mariah Mitchell. So Mariah Mitchell was born in Nantucket, or on Nantucket, I guess, in 1818. And she sort of first came to global awareness when she won this contest that the King of Denmark offered a prize to the first, a gold medal actually, to the first person to discover a new comet. And so, you know, all over Europe in these huge observatories, there are astronomers watching, and there's Mariah up on the roof of her house in Nantucket with her telescope, and she's the first. And so that experience opened a lot of doors for her. And then, of course, there's another beautiful picture book version of Mariah Mitchell's life that ends at that point with the discovery of the comet. I wanted to take my story further, so she then goes on to become a professor at Vassar College, one of the first women professors, like, because Vassar was just brand new at that point. So she went on to become a strong advocate for the higher education of women, not just in sciences, but in general. But she's also just a really interesting character, because she has this this intellectual honesty about her. Like she's a truth seeker. She's interested in everything, not only the sciences, philosophy, literature. She writes poetry, but she's so honest, and she wants the truth wherever she can find it. And if that means dismantling the way she has seen things before, then she'll do it. So she's not out there to protect this edifice. If something comes in and it's new and she examines it carefully and determines that, yes, it is true, she'll let the old way of thinking fall. And she's, as a teacher, that really characterizes her. So she's always saying to her students, don't just accept it because somebody who's considered an authority says it's so. Do your own work and do it thoroughly. And she said, and don't even just accept what I'm telling you, question everything. You know, you can take the basic mathematical principles as axioms, but question everything else. So
bingo. I mean, I can't think of go ahead.
So she goes through this evolution in her own life too, like spiritually, intellectually. So yeah.
I can't think of a better way to end our conversation, because that's exactly what we're just talking about. This entire conversation is about that. Yeah. It's about finding truth where you find it and questioning what the narrative that you've been fed and finding it for yourself. And yeah, I just think we got to end on that note, because that's beautiful and perfect. So you can find Laura. Where can we find you, Laura? LauraAlary.ca, right?
That's correct.
LauraAlary.ca. You can also Google you. You won't find anywhere on Laura's page that she has a PhD in New Testament, although I'm about to talk to Laura about that after we hang up. But you will find her books. You'll find blog posts, all sorts of stuff. You can get her books wherever you buy books. Well worth it. Thank you so much for this conversation. I hope it's one of many more. And friends that are watching, I hope that you tune into the other segments of this conversation. They'll all be posted on my YouTube channel. And thanks for listening and watching. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.